It will help for white people to understand why the trauma affects so many African Americans and how they deal with it. And we're all leaning on the same thing. I had epigenetics also in my presentation. I was like, I found that as well. But really just understand that when you are in a traumatic state and you are not receiving the healing or the help that you need, you are forever in that traumatic state. And so if someone who has not experienced trauma, they will not be able to help you because they don't know what that feels like. So I often say when I do a trauma presentation, the first thing I have is an affirmation to myself that says, I am not my trauma, right? And people put trauma on individuals, and then those individuals carry that trauma with them. Many of us have experienced some form of trauma, right? Whether it may be being in a house fire or losing someone close to you, you've experienced some form of trauma. But how you have dealt with that trauma is very different than what someone else may be able to deal with when it comes to that trauma. And then there are people who have experienced traumatic situations that no one could ever see themselves in, more or less know how to handle or deal with that. And oftentimes, I cannot say that I've lost a child. I cannot speak on that. But there are people that have lost children, and that is a traumatic experience. And so it is life-changing. And we have to understand that when trauma hits, the day it hits, it changes people's trajectory in their lives forever. The day before was a different day before the trauma. The day the trauma happens, that moment, that space, that time, that day, life changes for that person. And so I speak in regards to children who come to us who are experiencing trauma at a very young age. Many of us as adults, when we experience trauma, we struggle with moving forward. Imagine a young mind who may have seen a father the day before who later that evening is involved in gun violence and dies. And then the next day, the child is at school. So their mind hasn't caught on yet that there's some trauma that is happening and about to happen in that young person's life. And that young person will continue to carry that trauma. And oftentimes you'll hear people say, when I was young, I remember when this happened. And now they're 28 years old, or my father wasn't there for me, because that trauma never healed. And they carried it. And so in our families, that intergenerational trauma, we often put that on our children and from our families. And going back to when you say slavery, when I remember my grandfather and my grandmother, they never wanted to talk about slavery. That was just a part of their life they had blocked out. And when we asked, like, how was it growing up? I picked cotton, and that was it. And then they moved north. And it seemed like their life changed when they moved north. And all we hear about is what happened when they moved on the west side of Chicago. We never knew what happened in their past because the trauma that they endured, they never dealt with. They didn't want to talk about it. And so they brought us here into northern part of the country. And so we only know that. But then the trauma that our grandparents had filtered into our parents. And our parents filtered that into us, and we never understood, why is granddad so mean? Why is grandma so secretive? And, her children that's just how she is. That's just how she raised us. And then you do the same thing with the next generation. And that's how you get that intergenerational trauma that never was addressed. And sometimes people don't even know it was trauma, right? So oftentimes I ask people, this is the one thing, and I'm going to give you all just a space, a quick 30 seconds to think about this. Think about a traumatic experience that you've had in your life. Just think about it right now. And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to have you reflect on these questions. What was it? How did you overcome it, if you ever did? Who was involved in your trauma? How did it affect you and your everyday life? And then think about, when we talk about healing, how can you help others who have experienced similar trauma? So think about that. Because sometimes we don't think about our own trauma and how that affects others and how we deal with things. And sometimes people say things, not being mean, but just not understanding trauma. And so I'll give you an example. I lost my mom about 3 or 4 months ago, and I happened to be there during that experience, which was very traumatic. I was there when both of my parents died and took their last breath. And so people would check in on me and say, "How are you?" And I wanted to scream so bad, "I'm not okay." I really wanted to say that. "How are you?" "I'm not okay. I lost my mother, and I don't have a father. And I'm walking this world literally as an orphan," right? But people who knew, they would say, "It's a different world. It's a hard experience. I know what you're going through." And I would immediately start crying because I found a connection. So that person knew what I was going through and they knew how to respond. So when I hear people say, "I lost my mom," I just give them a hug. I know there are no words, but in that hug, and they just look at me and shake it. We have, as my brother called, we have found a new club that we don't want to be a part of. Right? This is not a club. And if you've never experienced it, people will say things and you want to look at them and say, "Did you just really say that?" That didn't even, but they don't know because they haven't experienced that. And so when we think about that trauma, so as we start to lose people in my family, we are connecting to others to help them, and even our own family, to say, "Hey, let's prepare for when your parents are passing and transitioning. How can we be there for you? How can we support you? And what do we need to build so that we are not devastated by this loss, but empowered and able to move on successfully in life?" Because I remember I talked to a young lady on the phone and she said, "If my mama died, I'm just going to die with her." I said, "Baby, you can't do that. I just came in without her. I'm just going to die with her." Because they have not been given the tools to deal with some of the trauma that the parent has been carrying for them. And the parent has continued to allow the trauma to continue. And so I realized, that is really devastating for someone to say, "I cannot function after this loss if it ever happens to me," right? And think about children who come in and lose parents. And you go, "Oh, I just don't understand what happened to Keisha. She was just such a good girl." And then I started digging deep. "Well, yeah, her mom died a couple of months ago, but I just don't understand." Did you just really say that? Did you just really hear what came out your mouth? Something has changed about Keisha. Yes, her mother passed away, but she's still not the same. She won't ever be the same, right? So how do we help support people to understand, don't continue the intergenerational trauma? And so I think about it as an African-American woman and the trauma that I experienced in my own culture. That in order for me to accept racial healing for someone outside of my culture, I have to accept racial healing within my culture. Because sitting here as a black woman with a doctorate is not an acceptable part of my culture as a black woman. Growing up, I did not get the pat on the back, "Go get your education." It was, "You're a woman, you're going to end up being on the same level as a man, and that's not your place." Being educated means being white. Being educated means you're better than we are. And so I had to hear that throughout my educational career as my mother helped to break the intergenerational curse of uneducated black people in our family. My mother had to be my barrier to say, "She is going to college." She is going to graduate. And when I did, my family was astonished. She actually graduated from college. We have a college graduate in our family. And I was a first-generational college graduate. And then the nerve of me to say, I want my master's. Wasn't your bachelor's enough? You'll never get married. Nobody will want you. You're too educated for the men. You laugh, but it's true. It is very true. And that is trauma. And people don't understand that. That is traumatic to hear someone say, your worth is less than who you are because you choose to become educated. It's traumatic to say that a man cannot see me for who I am because I'm educated. And of course, being young, no, that's not going to happen. And then I started to hear other women who were like me, and we had this conversation, and we all said, I wish someone had told me when I went to college to look for a man as well as get an education. And we believed that white women were told this because many white women found their college sweethearts and got married and had kids and had degrees. And we felt as black women, no one told us that. And so we sit and we go, we got our degrees. We first college graduate, we got jobs and everything, but we don't have any men. We're not married, right? And now it's a struggle. So when I talk to young women, young girls, I tell them you can have what you need in life. Don't allow us older women to dictate your success and happiness in life. Be the best person that you can be. If you want to be a married woman and have an education, you understand that trajectory and that path that you have to take. But we have to break that cycle because many women are having children out of wedlock because of the fear that they won't be able to get married. And that is some trauma, and I'm experiencing that in my own family and life, that even though I'm one that my family looks at, they see that she doesn't have kids, and that's not the trajectory we want. Right? And so when you look at that type of trauma that our young women and black women in particular are bringing, with the some of that trauma that you're hearing with women is the same. And our young girls are hearing that. Our young men, they experience trauma of being, you have to take care of your household. You have to be the breadwinner. And my brother is experiencing that, and I gotta carry the house. His wife will make more money, and he's like, but I have to be the man of the house, right? He has to understand that that's his role because that's what he's been taught, that's what he needs to do. And he said, I can't marry her until we get a house. I can't marry her until we do, I said, well, brother, you'll never get married. I said, go on to marry her and figure that out later because she won't wait for you. And so I also remember about when we are dealing with our young kids and we talk about gun violence. And when we are addressing people's historical connection to violence, we must be careful not to tell the backstory of a violent story. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes I hear, well, you know his dad was killed. But what does that mean? Right? And so are you saying that this young man will also result to gun violence? And so we have to be careful not to perpetuate a story that is not that person's story. Everybody lives their own life. So in my family, we had a strong connection to gang violence. Strong. I lost two relatives to straight gang violence. But no one would ever have known that, because I didn't uplift that. And all of the males in our family, because of the deaths and the killings that were attached to that, they did not lift that up. So we were able to break that very hard generational curse of once you're a gang member and you're in a gang family, you forever in a gang. We just did not want to do that because we saw the repercussions of that. And so that is what I'm saying and what we're saying here is that trauma and breaking trauma is very hard to do because it's forever a burden that people have to carry, and it's intergenerational to another generation, and it's very hard to break when we choose not to want to do it. But once it happens, it changes the lives of those who are involved. So once I was able to graduate with a degree, the women in my family changed. And they started to say, do whatever you want to do. And the religion women, it's okay. It's okay. Like, they validated me. And that meant so much to me. My mother validated me. And then I started to have women pull me to the side and say, we're so proud of you. We're so proud of you. You know, you're a good girl. We're so proud of you. They started to validate because they knew that I was not validated. And I kept going until I became a doctor. And the joy that I brought to not my family, but to a community, it became bigger. It became, this is someone who represents us. In our church, a member said, you are the only doctor in our church, right? You are the only person that we know that is in this position as a leader. And it became a belonging, a self-pride. And so when I say this, is that the individuals in Freeport who are really making a difference, we need to tap into what they are doing to show our future generation that this intergenerational trauma that everybody keeps bringing up and this baggage they keep saying that you are about is not true. You have your Pat Normans. You have your Audrey Morehouse. You have your James Ryan. You have these individuals in this community who have experienced trauma and have overcome it. And they are proud products of Freeport School District. Yes, give me. That's where we need to go. Because I promise you, if they tell their stories like a De Niro Thomas, they sit here and tell their stories, they went through a lot. People did not support them, probably within their own race. But they were able to overcome, and they are the ones who are sitting here with us, pushing through this fight. And our young people need to see this. And not hear what the mamas are saying, you're not going to be any good. You're just going to be like your daddy. Because guess what? 90% of the time, that's what they are hearing. And that's what they are believing. So we have to tap into people that can counteract and say, yeah, that was mom and dad's story, but that's not your story. And how can we make that happen? Mr. Ryan does Credible Messengers. These are individuals that have changed their lives. Kids need to look at them and say, you don't have to be a criminal as they identify you for your life. You made a mistake. How can you help others not make that mistake? Right? So when I think about intergenerational trauma, I think about how we continue those curses, but not just break down what we call curses, but break down the hurt that we never addressed. And so when it comes to racial healing, I realize within my own race, I have to heal from what was done to me before I can be upset at someone outside of my race who treats me a certain way. We have to love each other inside of our own communities before we can love others on the outside. How can white people love us when we're killing and hating on each other? What type of love is that? But when we uplift each other, care about each other, then white people will care about us too. So for me, when we talk about that intergenerational trauma, starting with our young people, is really saying, this is not a path that you need to go down, but everybody's going to experience the trauma. how